This story details the case of Edward Reeve, a young musician who met with a terrible fate. Those who killed him were described as pure evil, and you're about to find out why. Make sure to watch till the end so you don't miss any of the chilling details of this case. New Year's Eve is normally a time of celebration and self-reflection. But for one unlucky man, it was a time of tragedy. On December 31st, 2021, Edward Reeve would lay on the floor of his home as he slowly bled out. What could have created such a horrible scene? Was this the result of an accident or something much more sinister? Edward was a very talented musician who enjoyed playing the keyboard. His father, John Reeve, even said he was known by many for his music, which was played on the most renowned UK radio station, BBC Radio. Despite his popularity in the world of music, Edward was privately dealing with a disorder that only few people knew about. He was diagnosed as suffering from schizophrenia. Edward had been receiving support from a local mental health organization and was also taking medication for his disorder. Sadly, his mental health problems became more severe in the last 2 years of his life. The medication and therapy were no longer effective enough, so he turned to drinking and drugs to help him cope with his disorder. Using drugs can actually increase symptoms of schizophrenia and worsen their severity. This alone created a very dangerous situation for Edward. Because of all this, Edward was having trouble properly taking care of himself and his home. The more difficult things became, the more Edward relied on the drugs and alcohol to help him. On the night of December 29th, 2021, Edward was at a store near his house when he met a group of teenagers. Although he didn't know them, he decided to invite them back to his home to hang out. When the teens arrived at Edward's home, they all socialized, drank alcohol, and did drugs together. They all exchanged numbers so that they could contact each other in the future and possibly have another meetup like this one. Despite being welcomed into Edward's home and supposedly having a quote-unquote good time, the teenagers still didn't like him. In fact, one teen named Jack Hindley even stole a piece of computer equipment from Edward's home before leaving that night. Shortly after, Edward began calling Jack continuously to ask for more drugs. He called for 2 days straight, which caused Jack to get pretty aggravated. On December 31st, 2021, Jack eventually told Edward to F off and stop calling me. But this didn't stop Edward and only made him more persistent. On that same evening of December 31st, Jack, his friend Samuel Jones, and 3 teenage girls were wandering around the community where Jack lived. Around this time, Jack received another call from Edward asking if he had any cocaine or marijuana. So the teenagers decided to pay Edward a visit and give him what he wanted so he'd stop bothering them. They hopped on a train, got off at the station nearest to Edward's house, and then walked to his address. When they arrived, Jack and Sam smoked marijuana. It is unclear whether or not Edward was smoking with them, but this didn't stop Sam and Jack from reminding Edward how much they disliked him. They made fun of him for having holes in his socks. They referred to him as a pedo and a weirdo and laughed at him. They even went into Edward's music room and punched holes in the walls because they thought it would be funny. Edward even told them to stop trashing his house, but the boys didn't care. All of this started to make the 3 girls really uncomfortable, so they left. At this point, Edward was on a phone call with his mother, so he probably wasn't paying much attention to what was happening in the house. He might not have realized that he was alone in the house with Sam and Jack, who had a very sinister plan that he would soon discover. Edward thought that Jack and Sam just came over to give him drugs and hang out for a bit. But what he didn't know was that they had both brought large knives with them and they intended to use them. Sam and Jack found pleasure in bullying Edward and thought it would be fun to watch him squirm as they caused him pain. They waited for the right moment, and while Edward was on the phone with his mother, Sam and Jack would brutally attack him. They ambushed him in the living room and started stabbing him. Edward tried his best to get away from them, and he managed to make it outside into his garden. Afterwards, Jack and Sam quickly exited the house and took all the items that they thought would incriminate them. One of the saddest parts of this incident was that Edward was still alive when the two teens left. He had even looked them in the eye and asked for help, but they used an object to strike him in the face and walked away. He somehow found the strength to get back into the house and move around for a bit, but after bleeding profusely for almost an hour, Edward would collapse and pass away. He suffered 8 stab wounds, 4 incised wounds, and 5 puncture wounds. But the cut that caused the most damage was the one on his abdomen. The stab wound was so deep that it severed the left renal vein, which caused heavy bleeding and made his intestines hang out. He also had a laceration on his face that was so terrible it caused one of his eyes to cave in. The defensive injuries on both of his hands were so extreme that one of his thumbs had almost been severed. Several of the other wounds were inflicted from behind. It is clear that Edward fought as hard as he could to save himself from those two monsters, but unfortunately, it just wasn't enough. While Edward laid there in a pool of blood, the sick, twisted teens who took his life would go on to do something you'd never expect. When Jack and Sam left Edward's house, they were fist bumping, hugging, and laughing. They seemed to be happy about what they had just done. They eventually caught up to the same 3 girls they were with before and started bragging about killing Edward. In fact, around this time, Jack received a phone call from a friend who was in prison. Sam and Jack also shared their excitement and bragged to this friend about the awful things they had just done to Edward. Little did they know that all prisons record and monitor their inmates' phone calls. But even if they had known, they probably wouldn't care. These teens showed no concern or remorse for the heinous crime they had just committed. In fact, they even posed for a group photograph and went to a party with blood on their clothes that same night. Sam and Jack were proud of what they had done, and they were roaming around without a care in the world. But soon after, cameras would catch Sam doing something extremely disturbing that would show just how psychopathic he really was. That was CCTV footage of Sam reenacting how he stabbed Edward Reeve to death. But it doesn't end there. The next day, Sam tried to call Edward, and 2 days after, Jack went back to Edward's house to see if his body had been found yet. Edward's body was eventually discovered on the evening of January 4th by some concerned friends who went to check on him. They called the police immediately after. This means that his body had laid there for nearly 4 whole days before anyone found him. His blood was also found on items recovered from Jack and Sam's homes, and on the bag that Sam was seen carrying on the evening of the murder. Sam and Jack were arrested 3 days later on January 7th. Sam even tried to get his father to provide a false alibi for the night of the murder. They tried to claim that they did it in self-defense because Edward accused them of stealing his computer equipment. But the jury's verdict was unanimous, and they were found guilty of murder. The judge gave them both life sentences, where they were required to serve a minimum of 18 years. Edward's Aunt Helen labeled Sam and Jack as pure evil and said Edward's murder was like a horror show. I don't think there could have been a better way to describe these sinister teen killers who senselessly took the life of an innocent man. If you have a strange or disturbing incident that you'd like us to cover, send us an email at veryweirdish@gmail.com and let us know what you think about the case of Edward Reeve in the comments below. If you made it to the end of this video, that can only mean one thing. You are seriously into some weird-ish. So go ahead and press that like button, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more weird content just like this.